hoonete tehniline vastuvõtmine Põhja-Ameerika näitel on järgmine, pikem ettekanne. Ryan Lean, Building Commissioning Associationist on mees, kes sellel teemal meile räägib.
Thank you for having me. We're going to talk over the next 35 to 40 minutes about the history of commissioning in North America. My name is Ryan Lean. I'm an associate partner at Jarrow Spauman Bowles, which is a engineering and commissioning firm in New York City. I am also the current 2021 Building Commissioning Association president, which is an international not-for-profit commissioning association that solely focuses on building a more resilient commissioning workforce around the world. So really excited to talk a little bit about the history and the evolution of building commissioning in North America, and that as it relates to what you all are going through. So with that, we will get started here with In the Beginning. In the beginning, how it all started. Why are we talking commissioning? Why have I established a career in commissioning? Why is it still a big value proposition in the community of engineering and architecture? It does go back probably well before the energy crisis that we saw in the late 70s and early 1980s in America. It probably started way before that on the ships, the Navy ships that the United States military, prior to putting those ships into the water. What they did is they basically had to make sure that everything worked. You're putting people sometimes in dire conditions, certainly in battle, and you wanted to make sure that all of those systems work. So they talked about commissioning the ships. It was a couple of years or a couple of decades until the energy crisis in North America happened. The embargoes, the kind of cost of oil and gas started to rise exponentially, and people started to realize, what can we do and what steps should we take to try to mitigate this kind of change? So kind of going back to the beginning and trying to figure out what was going on, we gathered an industry approach, again, back in those times. The energy crisis exposed some inefficiencies in the buildings, right? Gone were the days where we can just start systems at the very beginning, of the day and let them run without ever kind of, looking at them again. So there was inefficiencies that needed to be corrected, but who was going to do that? There was utility support, meaning the utility companies in North America. There's different areas where there's centralized grids that feed the entire country, but within the grids and how you're feeding those grids are different utilities, some private, some public, and even the utility companies had realized at that time, we need to do something. There is an energy crisis, and we need to basically encourage through incentives or other things to make sure that buildings were doing what they can to reduce energy. As we know now, probably more than we ever knew before, the energy coming out of building use is something that a variable that we control, and also a big contributor to the carbon emissions that are going on all the time. HVAC continues to be, even today, an easy target for good reason. There's so many opportunities to save energy through the HVAC systems, but only if you're looking for them. So someone needs to create some sort of process by which you're going in and identifying problems within the HVAC systems so that you could, again, mitigate some energy use. And the solutions that were already in place weren't working at the time. Again, I'm talking about the 1980s. Really, it was led by comfort complaints. That was the only time anyone looked at anything. There was no real true validation process, no prescriptive method by which someone would go in and identify these problems. And even the highest tech buildings that were built, I will say this, and you may hear this come out of my mouth a couple of times today, designing a good building is not enough. It's not enough to design a good building and hope that things are going to work the way they're supposed to. Still in this generation, my guess is at least into the next generation, regardless of the technology that's out there, human beings, people that are operating these buildings, facilities managers, engineers, are doing an outstanding job, but they need to be aware that they can influence how the energy is used in the building. So the highest tech buildings still need that human interaction, that human support, that understanding of how systems are supposed to work. So today, certainly buildings much more complicated to design, much more complicated to build, and much, much more complicated to operate. Again, it's still that human effect that someone needs to go into a building and operate it. So they're safer, they're healthier, they're more comfortable. Sometimes they're more cost effective. That's not always the case. But essentially, you still need that human interaction to make sure that it's operating correctly. So again, more things about why, and this is the reason why I'm focusing on the why, is because it is the value proposition when you're trying to sell commissioning as a value add. It seems kind of strange to me that we're still talking about it, but certainly you could be in a place where you're trying to talk to an owner or developer or prove the value of what commissioning brings to the table. So improper system installations. Remember, everybody installing systems in a particular building are doing what they know best, which is that individual piece of equipment, that individual system type. But everything in a building needs to talk to each other, hence the system integration issues, right? So you can install a chiller, you can install a chilled water pump, you can install a condenser water pump, you can install a condenser water cell, right? Just because the chiller comes on, what tells the corresponding pump to come on? Or is it designed for two pumps to come on with a single chiller, or vice versa? Same with the boilers and pumps, same with air handlers and terminal units downstream. Who is talking to each other? And that integration is huge and part of the commissioning process when we set up. Poor air quality, very, very top of mind right now with the COVID pandemic. Certainly we know through the COVID pandemic that indoor air quality in buildings is related, and it's a variable that we can control because the coronavirus is very much an airborne disease. So we've learned that filtration supports and picks up particulates in that range of where COVID can be carried on particulates. We know that UV lights, bipolar ionization, different technologies exist. But back in the 1980s, right, there was other issues that we were worrying about, just particulates, radon, Legionnaire's disease, things that are happening inside a building. So it's not always just about the energy. It's also about healthy buildings and how we're operating it. Certainly, construction costs started to go up. Things got more expensive. And as things got more expensive and more complicated, therefore came the need to make sure that those systems were operating properly, right? So the high cost of operating buildings and the high cost of construction, there's probably people somewhere in the high executive level suites saying, if I'm paying more for it, I want to make sure that somebody is going in and checking that I'm getting what I paid for. And again, this is not to throw stones in glass houses and say that everyone is not doing the right job. There is just a lot of integration, and people are tasked with certain things, and there needs to be someone as an overlay quality assurance process that goes in and makes sure that everybody is, or that all the systems are operating as they should. So again, not to remove the need for any particular contractor, trade, engineer, but somebody watching the entire process from beginning to end. So what is commissioning? I've been talking about commissioning, making the assumption that you understand exactly what the process is. I want to define it really quickly. So commissioning, the Ashrae standard, Ashrae is an acronym. It stands for the American Society for Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. So I know that's a lot, but if you have not heard of Ashrae, I would look it up. The standard 202 back in 2013 defines what commissioning is, which is a quality-focused process for enhancing the delivery of a project. I'm going to say process. The definition includes process. It's very important because when people think commissioning, they typically think construction phase testing, and that's only a small portion of the entire process. So the process focuses upon verifying and documenting that all commissioned systems and assemblies are planned, designed, installed, tested, operated, and maintained to meet the owner's project requirements, or OPR. It's interesting, and again, as a reflection on this, installed, tested is only listed once in that whole sentence, that whole 2 sentences. So remember, commissioning is a process. Now, there's different ways you can buy commissioning, different from engineering, different from architecture, different from some of the other trades. Commissioning is very much a long menu of opportunities that you could include, and there's always the best practice, but that's the most money. We're going to talk about mandates and requirements on commissioning and what that means. Typically, when you're talking mandates and code requirements, that's the least you can do or the worst you can do, basically the minimum. So that's different from the best practices, which is the entire process from beginning to end. So the BCXA, or Building Commissioning Association best practices, which we hold all of our members responsible for upholding throughout their work, is a systematic process of assuring by verification and documentation, again, from design phase to a minimum 1 year after construction, so it doesn't end in construction, goes at least a year out, that all facility systems perform interactively in accordance with the design, in accordance with the OPR, and including preparation of operating personnel. So that means training the operators that are responsible for working on the building and basically upholding it and maintaining it. Almost as important as what commissioning is what commissioning is not. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but it is not testing at the end, like showing up and just testing. You can't show up to a building without a plan. Need to understand how the systems work. I don't care how many you've done in the past. You need to show up with a plan, a test script, and an understanding that there's other people associated with the team, not just the commissioning provider. It is not testing and balancing, completely different and only one small facet of the commissioning process. And it is certainly not only a documentation effort, although it has been said in the past that it's very much paperwork heavy, although now where we are with all these cloud-based tools, it's not just paperwork anymore. It is certainly on the cloud. So a little bit of a history lesson here. And again, going back to some of the things I mentioned earlier, you could read through this later, but I wanted to bring up a couple of specific examples. University of Wisconsin in 1984 became the first university in America to offer commissioning courses. Today, there are several more, certainly not still widespread. Most commissioning providers come from other trades, other industries, or out of an engineering college. In that same year, Ashrae, I mentioned earlier, American Society for Heating and Refrigeration Engineers, created their commissioning committee. And then 4 years later, in 1988, they published their first commissioning guideline. And then very important, in 1993, as part of the White House Conference on Global Climate Change, commissioning was in that packet. So again, at a very high level, from the highest level in the country, talking about reducing climate change, reducing carbon emissions, a lot of the same things that we're talking 30 years later, but commissioning was in that guideline, and that was a big step for the industry. Also in 1993, again, Building Commissioning Association, celebrating many anniversaries over the last couple of years, had our first ever national conference on building commissioning. Used to be called the NCBC, where all the best providers in the country came once a year to meet and greet and share stories and education. We just had our conference, our first ever international hybrid conference in Toronto earlier this month. So I was in Toronto opening up that conference, and all of those courses still available if you want to check them out online. In 1998, so fast forward a couple of years, the Building Commissioning Association was incorporated as a not-for-profit. We are still the only commissioning association purely dedicated to the commissioning industry. There are other associations out there that have commissioning kind of portions of their association, but it is not the only thing that they do. BCA is an international association, so most of our membership is in North America. but we do have international members, and there's lots of good information there for, starting off checklists and best practices and other white papers and blogs and information. So if you need anything, feel free to drop by that website. Also in 1998, the USGBC, which is the United States Green Building Council, rolled out their LEED criteria, so their LEED rating system, also now very much international. And it included commissioning as a fundamental prerequisite. So that means you had to do it. Now, the LEED rating system includes a lot of things, from sustainable materials through energy reduction and water reuse. But at the time, there's only 7 prerequisites out of the 50, 60, 70 credits. And commissioning is one of the prerequisites, meaning you had to do it. It was a requirement. There was no other question. That probably single-handedly changed the landscape for commissioning, bar none. Absolutely the reason probably why there's a lot of commissioning providers out there today. LEED really set the tone. Now, people argue it's not the best. It's the minimum. It's changed over the years, but it doesn't matter. That was the carrot or the stick method. That was the stick, and you had to do it. And, basically a new industry was formed after that. In 2004, fast forwarding a couple of years, the BCCB, which is the Building Commissioning Certification Board, was established. ANSI accredited, Department of Education recognized certification. So the certifications are both for the individual, that's the CCP and the ACP, as well as the firm. There are some codes, there are some RFPs that come out from developers saying that you need to have some sort of certification. If you do, you can grab one of these certifications. The CCP is a test along with qualifications that you've done work in some sort of a project manager level. The ACP is a little bit under that, where you've had some experience with commissioning, but not at a project manager level. And you can only be a firm if you are provided with at least one CCP on staff. Again, continuing into more recent years, there's been a lot of training certification programs that are out there. Ashrae continues to put out new guidelines. The first states started to incorporate commissioning codes and standards. So commissioning is in the International Energy Code as a requirement. And a lot of states in North America and in the United States have picked up that requirement on their local code. So it's essentially a copy and paste of what the International Energy Code says for commissioning into the states as a requirement. And that is certainly, again, the carrot or the stick method that has certainly pushed the industry forward from where it used to be. And then today, 2010 until today, the Ashrae Standard 202, more Ashrae standards keep coming out. Really, what's changed, I think, in the most recent past, the most recent years, is all of the commissioning tools and templates. You see that right there in the middle bullet. There are a lot of cloud-based tools. As of a couple of years ago, my firm, I've been doing this for 20 years or so, my firm has been using Microsoft Word and Microsoft Excel for all of our test scripts. That is no longer the case. We now use third-party software. The cloud tools are amazing. It allows contractors, developers, owners, other interested parties on the website, see the status as it's happening, see the deficiencies that are found in the issues in the field as they're happening. It's really allowed us to move faster and do what we need to do, more simply. So let's explain commissioning a little bit of phases. When we asked owners, this is from 2015, so the data is about 7 years old, but it's probably still the same today. When does commissioning start? I mentioned earlier that it starts very early and very late, ends very late. That is the ideal scenario. That is the best practice. That's not always the case. But 44%, so at least the majority of those surveyed, does say that it starts in design. 27% of the owners that responded to the survey so that it starts in pre-design. That's amazing. That's the earlier, the better. In theory, I'd like to see the commissioning provider hired even before the engineers and architects to help the owner with the owner's project requirements, the ideal way that the building is going to be set up so that they can help and support with the engineering and the architecture. Then you see 24% or so in construction. That's obviously the least ideal. You don't want to see that because then sometimes it's too late. Things have started, wheels are in motion, and it's too hard and difficult to change things after they start. And this is just more survey data, amount of commissioning projects that include the design phase. So more than 80%, there's only 25% of those surveyed. So, again, that's not great. You'll see, less than 20% to up to 60%. Probably if you sum all those together, 50 to 60% of those surveyed says that it really doesn't happen in the design phase. We're still trying to change that. Commissioning is still an afterthought in a lot of places, but if you deal with good clients and good developers who understand the value proposition, you're going to be starting earlier, and that's really just good for the project. Part of submittal reviews, part of understanding what things are supposed to happen, how systems are supposed to be purchased, procured, installed, and started up. So if we go and start in a phase-by-phase approach on how this all looks, and all the work that I kind of mentioned earlier, that's not in the testing phase only. If you start in the pre-design phase, what happens? Developing CX scope and budget. So that's really important because the money that's going to be spent on commissioning is not just for the commissioning provider. You see here, there are four kind of categories here from owner, commissioning provider, team, and contractor. Commissioning does not happen in a vacuum by a single party, right? It needs to be a coordinated effort with multiple parties and multiple teams. So developing the budget is not just for the commissioning provider, it's also for the contractor. How much more time are they going to spend during this process to support the commissioning process? I could tell you in the United States, in North America, that's not an issue anymore. Every contractor I've ran into over the last 5 years or so certainly understands what they need to be, what needs to be done by them on a particular project. So that's already happening, but developing the scope and budget needs to identify costs for all parties, including the design team and the contractor. And by the way, this is not an added cost to the project above and beyond which you would spend way more if it's not done right during construction and you're paying for issues after everyone has left and now people have to come back and it's out of the warranty phase. So now you're paying for it out of pocket. The costs and the value proposition of what you're paying for commissioning far exceeds, and this has been proven in survey data, far exceeds any cost that you're going to spend. And certainly the payback typically is within 1 year. So again, a lot of that stuff happens in the pre-design phase. And you see in the design phase also, you're reviewing drawings, you're going to meetings, and you're helping to write specifications. Because again, if things are not in the spec, then you're going to run into issues later where the contractor or someone says, this was never part of my scope. So you need to identify and be transparent from the beginning about what it's going to take to do the work. And then you'll have less pain later on. So if we go into the construction and turnover phase, you can see the vast majority of the work does happen in the construction phase. You can see if you look at the commissioning provider line, there's a lot of things in there. From reviewing submittals, and of course, what everyone loves to see right in the middle is you're verifying, you're writing the pre-functional performance checklist, you're writing the functional checklist, you're executing those, you're issuing the updated issue log. But the takeaway from this slide, what I want everyone to see and be aware of, is look at all the coordination with the other parties. Look at how many times the contractor gets involved with the submittals, with the schedule, attending meetings, filling out the checklist, doing the startup reports, executing and participating in functional testing. Then at the end, design team reviewing submittals at the beginning and at the end reviewing the O&Ms and the systems manual. This is very much a team effort. Don't let anyone tell you anything different, and don't expect the commissioning provider to be a superhero and do everything on their own, because if they are, then they're not doing the job of good service. You want to make sure that you're including everybody and everyone is on the same page for an effective commissioning project. And then if you look at kind of the end, the occupancy and the operations phase, so now new construction portion of your project is done. What happens now? You still have as-built that you need to review. There's probably some seasonal testing. Let's just say that you have a chiller plant, that the building was turned over in the wintertime. Maybe you want to wait until 6 months later and make sure the summertime comes around and you're able to test it then. You're updating systems manuals. Really, really important, the training of the operating team. I think I've said it already, but you want to make sure that you're doing the training so the operations teams understand every building is different. It's not like a car on a manufacturing line where it's the same doors and the same steering wheels and the same tires on every single car. I've never seen two buildings that are the same. Even if they look identical from the outside, there's always differences on the inside. So we want to make sure that the training happens as soon as possible, typically during the construction phase when you're doing the testing, but also at the very end, making sure that all training was done and worked out. And then towards the end, after you see 2/3 of the way where it says commissioned building, that little block where it says commissioned building, what you're going to find is most scopes will end there, right? But the ideal scenario, the best practice is to make sure that after the building is quote unquote commissioned, that there's some program to make sure that you're continually monitoring what happens after the building is turned over. You want to monitor the energy performance essentially during the new construction phase and all of the phasing up until you turn it over. You're establishing a baseline. You're setting everything up the right way. You're making sure your energy use baseline is set. But then what happens is there's cold complaints and hot complaints, and a fan goes out of service, or a pump goes down, or an automatic transfer switch doesn't transfer. Whatever happens, there are probably manual changes that are made every single day in every building. And what you want to do is make it a repeatable thing that's in your schedule, that you're going back, you're monitoring what's going on. The manual changes in the building become reset at some point, and you're tracking energy performance also to make sure that the building does go back essentially to the baseline. So what's changing in the current environment with commissioning, and what's kind of driving a lot of work on the commissioning side? Certainly you see the top one on the list all the way on the left is mandates. Carrot and stick, usually the stick works for the most part. People, if it's in code, they don't want to disregard it. If it's a law, certainly it is a law in New York City, I can tell you, on the energy code side to do the commissioning. So mandates do work. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So that's probably where the majority of the work is going to be. But again, when something is mandated in the law, in the code, what essentially happens is you're going to get the worst kind of commissioning that you can get, because it's not driven by best practices. It's not driven by, good faith and good work. It's really driven by making sure you're complying. So for sure, it works, and there's good reason why it does work, but it's certainly not going to get the best practices. Where you start to look into savings, marketability. So from the marketability standpoint, really what you're talking about is my building, telling the world that my building is in a good place. And why that's really important, especially today, is because social media and the internet and influencers out there. I can tell you there was an example that I ran into on a very high luxury residential building where the fan coil units or heat pumps in the building were not operating properly. There was a problem with the plant, wasn't putting out the right temperature air, and someone who paid a lot of money for a particular residential unit was not happy, went on the internet, and that building had a hard time rolling out new tenants and signing new leases in that building, because it was all over the internet that the building was not set up properly. Without any of the details, any of the technical details, it really didn't matter at that point. It's very hard to fight that perception in the market. So, commissioning can certainly help with that. Other market conditions that are happening. As we know, the interesting part is, cybersecurity is a big deal. We now have all of these systems that are tied into the internet one way or another. You can monitor elevators going up and down in your building from your phone. We now have thermal imaging cameras in lobbies to take temperature of people walking in the building. There's whole building discussion. So commissioning typically revolved around, again, this is back from the 80s to, just of recent, mostly on the HVAC side. LEED has updated their guidelines to include electrical systems and some plumbing systems, but certainly you have fire protection systems, you have IT systems, you have cybersecurity systems. All those things have bells and whistles that need to be commissioned to make sure that they're working not just properly within their own system, but integrated into the network of the building. So there's a lot more kind of critical infrastructure nowadays that we need to make sure we're taking care of. And expanding a little bit on the value of commissioning, there's a lot of gaps that happen between the architects and the engineer and the design and the outcomes. I said it earlier, I'll say it again. Designing a building, a great building, an energy efficient building, a healthy building is not good enough. Constructing a healthy building, constructing an energy efficient building is not good enough. You need to go in and make sure and confirm and have a process around making sure that those buildings do what they were intended to do. And that takes people, certainly with technology and other systems, but it takes people walking around the building, making sure that systems are working properly. But it's not without challenges, of course, which is why we're talking about it today. There are challenges with, the value proposition of commissioning. There are also challenges with, making sure that buildings are just operating in the right way. But again, some of these challenges all have opportunities. So reducing life cycle cost of assets. I mean, making sure you're going in, changing filters regularly, watching when chilled water valves are modulating more than a couple times in an hour. Looking at those things from the standpoint of how our system is going to work for the next 50 years, someone needs to be looking at that. Disaster resilience, making infrastructure buildings more resilient against climate change and natural disasters. So moving the electrical systems from the bottom of the building to the top of the building. Commissioning, by the way, is not just new building. I'm talking today mostly about new building commissioning, but there is a term called EBCX, or existing building commissioning, which happens in existing buildings all of the time because space changes or spaces change within a building. The types change, the systems move and get updated, and someone needs to consistently go in and make sure that it is checking. And I did mention the real new opportunities, the things I'm excited about are whole building commissioning. So not just HVAC, like I mentioned, but cybersecurity. Someone needs to go in, and that is a new opportunity, a new field where someone needs to go in and make sure and basically, test the systems to see that they're secure. New technology, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of cloud-based tools that are out there that help with the commissioning provider side of things. There's also drone technology that we're using on building envelope commissioning, so you don't have to, propel yourself off the side of the building to look at the cladding. You can actually just send a drone out there. And it's the same with, I haven't used them yet, but I'm waiting for the opportunity for a robot or a machine to walk around the building, do inspections with a camera, and I could be looking at it from home and making sure we're doing the inspections right. So there's a lot of cool opportunity out there. And then the last thing important to say here, fault detection and predictive technology. So it's one thing to go into a building and look at it with your eyes and get above the ceiling and open the access doors and look at a modulating damper on a variable air volume terminal unit. But it's a whole different thing to monitor and log the activity over a good amount of days or weeks or months and basically predict when something's going to fail. So identifying how many rotations on the actuator and compare that to the end of life for the actuator before you have a failure. So kind of predicting things that are going to happen. Also with simultaneous heating and cooling, right? The user in their seat in their office doesn't know that anything's going wrong because the temperature is okay, but you have both the chilled water valve and the hot water valve open at the same time, wasting energy. Wouldn't really know it. There's no alarms. There's no issues necessarily to bring your attention to it, with the exception that the predictive technology is telling you that you're simultaneously heating and cooling. So what do you do next? Again, we're talking a lot about North America and the history, knowing where you are today without any specific mandates. It's really about proving the value, continuing to use the best practices, identifying, leveraging what I've kind of explained to you that's happened in North America, but identifying issues in buildings and identifying the potential saving of both money and time and callbacks and opportunity for blame. All of that goes away when you have a really good commissioning provider as part of the project. So it's really kind of, we talk about energy a lot, but it's beyond energy. It's healthy buildings, it's resiliency. I can tell you in New York City, I've worked on some pretty prominent buildings that really didn't care about energy. They cared about getting people out of the building safely. So it was really the fire protection, fire alarm systems that they were worried about. So it really depends. You have to identify what is the issue and what's the owner want to see. And from that standpoint, you can kind of leverage and move with that. Just some additional resources before we close it out. If you wanted to identify some of the best practices, how to do it a little better, certainly you can reach out to me on LinkedIn or social media or email. But at the end of the day, there are some good manuals that you could take a look at, best practices. I did mention new construction and existing building. The ongoing commissioning is really kind of after turnover, like I mentioned earlier. And then just some more resources. These are publications. They're available hard copy or electric e-copy, basically some handbooks and some stakeholders guide, which was a joint effort with Ashrae from the owner side of things. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you so much. Really appreciate the time that you've allowed me to explain a little bit about commissioning, which you can tell I'm very excited to talk about. And if you have any questions, look forward to them.